don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
The Grey Knights are one of the coolest parts of Warhammer 40k for me. I think the idea of an esoteric mystical order of space knights is a fantastic representation of the strangeness of the setting of 40k. That the Grey Knights are both necessary and also effective should bring into stark contrast a number of the many strange contradictions that make up the rich tapestry of the Grimdark Future's history. I'm not here to give you a breakdown of their history or their lore, although I do think they'd be right at home on a channel called Hardly Heroic. No, today I'm going to engage in some argumentation about something that seems obvious to me, but apparently isn't in the wider community. Namely, why don't the Grey Knights have chainswords? Yeah, I can hear the jaws drop in realization. One of the most iconic Imperial weapons, and the Grey Knights don't even use them. They haven't used them, to my knowledge, although somebody will probably be able to correct me in the comments. But, I mean, we can look at the Grey Knight Index. It's not large, and the Grey Knights have never had many units, and nowadays we have Nemesis Force weapons, although in previous editions they would bother to specify which was which, as if a halberd and two swords were the same fundamental thing, but I digress. You might be wondering about why the chainsword is even a question in the first place. Well, allow me to make some arguments. Firstly, the chainsword is an Imperial weapon. It's one of the most potent symbols of the Imperium that exists. You might show 100 people 100 different power swords, and they may or may not be able to identify them as Imperial. But you show one person a chainsword, and they instantly know what it is. Grey Knights are Space Marines, and yet they do not make use of this most iconic weapon. Now, the natural counter-argument is, so what? The Grey Knights are an elite institution within an already elite institution of the Space Marines. A lot differentiates them from normal Space Marines and normal Space Marine operations. They are all psychers to some extent, they make frequent use of Terminator armor, and their most basic sidearm, the Stormbolter, is already considered a precious relic within the Imperium at large. I would however counter that there might be some actually good reasons why I think using a chainsword would actually be a perfect fit for the Grey Knights. Firstly, I've never actually seen any definitive debate about whether or not chain weapons cannot be force weapons. Force weapons take a wide variety of forms, but presumably the act of imbuing a weapon with psychic energy has more to do with the building of the psychic interface between the user and the weapon than any inherent property or structure of the weapon itself. Secondly, let's consider cases where the chainsword might be useful. Generally speaking, chainswords are a high attack, low AP weapon. So what that means is, generally speaking, when you use chainswords, you expect the unit that's using them to have a lot of attacks, but that those attacks won't do a lot of damage against someone who is wearing a lot of armor. Chainswords are traditionally described as being less effective against armor than, say, for example, power weapons, but generally much better at dealing with fleshy or tough opponents. The primary enemy of the Grey Knights, let's not forget, are the Demons of Chaos, and generally they don't have good armor saves. In fact, demonic hordes are frequently made up of tough but poorly protected demons. In this kind of scenario, a weapon that is useful for launching many attacks to cut into tough flesh would make for an ideal weapon for the Grey Knights to have, in my opinion. Furthermore, if the chainsword is enhanced with the power of a Psyker's Might, well, now we can imagine that it would be able to cut through way more tougher things than a normal chainsword would be able to. We know that the Demons of the Warp are generally more vulnerable to melee weapons than they are ranged weapons. That's just built into their collective understanding of the setting. But of course, the most intimidating form of any kind of sword, in my opinion again, is the chainsword. It's a lethal combination of engine, weapon, and force of destruction. Of course, there is another counter-argument, as there always is. A chainsword is, by its nature, a complicated device. It relies on some kind of mechanical system to function. A chainsword that does not whir is not really a chainsword that is useful. Whereas force weapons, as we've seen them mostly, they primarily rely on the psychic might of the wielder. There's no inherent mechanical operation that allows the force weapon to function. It's purely a psychic one. Adding an additional layer of complexity to the weapon might make it so that the sword could actually fail in combat when it might be needed the most. Maybe if the mechanism gets jammed or otherwise damaged. A force weapon that breaks is still in theory a force weapon that could be used to kill. A chainsword that breaks, well, that's just a very, very fancy looking club. I don't think that's an unfair argument. Certainly a chainsword is much more complicated in structure than a regular sword, but it's also not something that we see talked about in the lore or the background, really. When was the last time you heard about a Space Marine's chainsword getting broken in combat, and that preventing them from getting another chainsword to fight in combat? When was the last time something like that even mattered in the context of the tabletop game? It's not as if weapons have durability in the tabletop game that you'd have to worry about. We just assume that whatever somebody has is enough to last them for the fight. It hasn't ever come up in any game that I've ever played, and I don't think it necessarily has to factor in as well. Obviously, I care a lot about whether or not the Grey Knights have chainswords, because I'm definitely trying to avoid spending any money on making such a conversion. No, sorry, I am definitely not thinking about that at all. But, however, I also think it's a small part of a broader conversation on the very limited nature of the Grey Knight Codex itself. What should the Grey Knight Codex look like? How should we, as Grey Knight players, think about our Codex and the options that we have? Certainly, I know a lot of people who are quite disgruntled by the current state of the Codex, especially in an edition where tanks are very strong and Grey Knights tend to struggle against tanks. Unlike the Custodes, who have a small but very specific roster to themselves, Grey Knights are still recognizably Space Marines. They have some, including myself, would say cooler helmets and different weapons, but you still have a baseline Firstborn Marine and Terminator body. Yes, you can throw on a few more purity seals, but nobody would easily mistake a Custodes for a Space Marine. That's not the same that could be said for Grey Knights. I know there's definitely a conversation to be had about how, or even if, the Grey Knight should be expanded upon with new units. I would certainly be open to having that conversation, possibly in another video. But counter-argument, let's take, for example, the Space Marine Centurion. I think that would be a perfect addition to the Grey Knight army. We already know that Grey Knights don't like to use dreadnoughts. It's not an honor for them, they would rather die and be buried on Titan. But they still need fire support. They don't have a lot of vehicles, and Grey Knights are primarily an infantry-heavy force, so to me, it would make sense for them to have some kind of enhanced weapon platform with all the fire that they would need. Something that isn't a full-on Nemesis Dreadnought, because, as we've established, they don't necessarily like using Dreadnought-class vehicles for every sort of thing, and, of course, Nemesis Dreadnoughts are a rare and precious commodity. A Centurion warsuit, on the other hand, is a much more accessible technology, and of course we can imagine that they would easily be able to augment it with additional psychic weaponry. I think it would be much easier to fend off a demonic horde when you have psychically enhanced, twin-linked heavy bolters saturating the enemy with mind bullets than not, but that's just me. If we keep adding Grey Knight variants of Space Marine things, then maybe we'd be going too far, and suddenly the regular Space Marines don't seem as shiny, they don't seem as worthwhile. Why play a Space Marine army if you can have everything in a Space Marine army but better in a Grey Knight army? Well, I think at some point you'd have to draw the line. Otherwise, what would there be to differentiate the Grey Knights from the Space Marines? If only for the fact that the Grey Knights would be better than the Space Marines in basically every single way. Of course, you could make arguments that maybe the Grey Knights shouldn't be as good as Space Marines at shooting combat. Maybe that some Space Marine units would just be categorically disallowed in a Grey Knight army. But then again, of course, there are Space Marine chapters that are more specialized for melee than others, like the Blood Angels and arguably the Black Templars and Space Wolves. So that's a complicated matter. How do you differentiate the Grey Knights? Well, they're psychic, but they're only psychic in a game where psychic powers just don't go as far as they used to. My point is that when you play the Custodes, you know that you're actually going to be playing something that has its own flavor to the Space Marines. The Custodes and Marines are related, but they're still distinct. They see themselves as having different roles within the context of the Imperium, and the fans definitely see that as well. The Grey Knights complicate matters by being another special exception, which, to be fair to them, they are quite special, but without going so far as to make them a completely different thing altogether. And therein lies the rub. They are Space Marines, but they're different. Now we can easily imagine, for example, that Deathwatch would have access to a wide variety of things that every Space Marine chapter would have, because after all, they're normal Space Marines drafted specifically for the purpose of fighting aliens. Arguably, you could make the case that they should have a couple more things, and they do, but what about the Grey Knights? They're also Space Marines. They use many of the same Space Marine implantation processes. Arguably, they are different because they're held to a higher standard, but they're still Space Marines. So what should we do then? Maybe the solution would be to do something like the Emperor's Gene Seed is so good that it fundamentally differentiates them from baseline Marines in some way. I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear ideas that you might have. Just leave them in the comments, please. So yeah, this is a bit of a rambly video. As I said in my community post, my health has taken a bit of a decline, and there's some stuff going on with work as well. So if you like this video, please feel free to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, talk about it with your friends, fight them on Grey Knights. I've been a long time Grey Knight player. I've played them since more or less, like, I had the 5th edition Codex, and that was not back when things were Codex Demon Hunters, and yeah, I really do care about them a lot, but they're not necessarily in a great place right now, and they haven't necessarily been in a great place for a long time. And I think a big part of that is just there's a bit of an identity issue with what the Grey Knights should be within the wider context of what Marine armies look like and how Marine armies should play. Because remember, this is also a tabletop game, so it's not enough that the Grey Knights look cool and they have all this cool lore and stuff like that. They also need to be able to play competitively, against other people's armies. And again, it's a complicated issue. I do like the fact that they are primarily infantry focused, that they are more specialized towards melee combat in various different ways. They have cooler helmets and so on and so forth, but it's not necessarily as simple as just giving them Space Marine units, because that, I think, would probably upset a lot of people and, throw off a lot of internal balance. I think there has to be some way of amending to the Grey Knights new capacities and new capabilities in ways that extend them a little bit. Also, another contentious opinion, I think, which again might stir me up into trouble, is the Grey Knights are really the only army in 40k that are locked to a particular color, I feel like we maybe should move away from Grey Knights as being purely grey and maybe move them into other colors as well. I think that's possibly something else that, we might have to think about, because they really are the only army that just looks one particular way. And yes, they do look very cool, but maybe they could look cooler, I've seen other people with Grey Knight schemes that have like red schemes or blue schemes or black schemes, and maybe that would go a long way to further making them appeal to a bit of a wider audience, because it's fun to play Grey Knights, but it's also fun to have lots of people who are also playing Grey Knights. So I'll try to release videos as I get the opportunity to, commenting, engaging with the channel. That always helps justify in my mind to keep doing this stuff. But importantly, I also plan on branching out to make videos about some video games that I've been playing. I know this is primarily a tabletop channel, but I also like video games. I like talking about video games, and I know that there's according to my analytics at least, there's a substantial overlap between people who watch channels like this and also people who play video games. So maybe some people might be interested in hearing some of my thoughts about video games. If you have any ideas or would want to make a suggestion about what I should listen to, or maybe what you'd like to listen to from me regarding maybe like a video game essay, then by all means, please feel free to leave it in the comments below. Take care, everybody, and have a nice day.